Hey everybody, welcome back to Philly in the Brain, and today we're going to unpack a topic that is on or should be on everybody's mind at this moment, and that is, can the President of the United States deploy the U.S. military on U.S. soil to police U.S. citizens? That is the question. We're going to dive right into it. All right, let's go. It's a question that touches on some of the most fundamental principles of American democracy. You might think the president is the commander-in-chief, so they can do whatever they want with the military, right? But the answer is a resounding no, not when it comes to deploying active duty troops on American soil for law enforcement. There are very specific laws and historical precedents that limit this power, and for good reason. These laws are crucial for protecting our civil liberties and maintaining the delicate balance of power in our government. We're going to dive deep into these legal safeguards, starting with a law you might have heard of: the Posse Comitatus Act. The general rule, the Posse Comitatus Act. So let's start with the big one, the foundational rule that generally says, hands off military when it comes to domestic policing. We're talking about the Posse Comitatus Act. Now, that's a fancy Latin phrase, but it essentially means the power of the county or the force of the county. Historically, it referred to the common law power of a sheriff to call upon able-bodied men to assist in keeping the peace. But in the US, it took a very specific meaning after the Civil War. The Posse Comitatus Act was signed into law in 1878. Its primary purpose was to prevent the federal government from using the U.S. Army to enforce domestic policies, particularly in the southern states during the Reconstruction era. Think about it. After a brutal civil war, there was a strong desire to ensure that the military wouldn't be used as a political tool to suppress citizens or interfere in civilian affairs. The core of the act states that it's generally unlawful to use any part of the Army or Air Force, and as of 2021, the Navy, Marine Corps, and Space Force as posse comitatus, or otherwise for the purpose of executing the laws. So in plain English, the military is for fighting wars and defending our country from threats outside our borders, not for acting like a police force on our streets. It's a fundamental principle that separates our military from our civilian law enforcement. It ensures that our armed forces remain focused on national defense and don't become entangled in domestic political disputes or law enforcement activities that could infringe on the rights of citizens. That's a critical distinction. The act is a cornerstone of the principle of civilian control over the military, which is a bedrock of American democracy. It prevents a scenario where a president can simply order troops to enforce laws or suppress dissident without proper civilian oversight and legal justification. However, and this is a big however, the act does include a crucial phrase: except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or by act of Congress. This little clause is where things get interesting, and it leads us directly to the primary exception of the Posse Comitatus Act, the Insurrection Act. The big exception, the Insurrection Act. All right, so if the Posse Comitatus Act is the general rule, then the Insurrection Act of 1807 is the big flashing exception sign. This law actually predates the Posse Comitatus Act by over 70 years, and it gives the president some very specific powers to deploy the military domestically, but it's not a blank check. Mic check 1, 2. The Insurrection Act is a powerful tool, but it's meant for extreme circumstances. It empowers the president to deploy the U.S. military and even federalize National Guard units in specific dire situations to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, or armed rebellion against the federal government. Think of it as a last resort when civilian law enforcement and state authorities are overwhelmed and unable to maintain order. So what are these dire circumstances? When can a president actually pull the trigger on the Insurrection Act? There are three main scenarios outlined in the act. Number one, at the request of the state. If a state's legislature or its governor, if the legislature can't be convened, requests federal assistance to address an insurrection within that state. Number two, to enforce federal law. If an insurrection in any state makes it impossible to enforce federal law through ordinary judicial proceedings. Number three, to protect constitutional rights. If domestic violence, an unlawful combination, or a conspiracy in any state deprives citizens of their constitutionally secured rights, and that state is unable or unwilling to protect those rights. So, it's not just about a president deciding that they want to send in the troops. There has to be a real breakdown of order, and often a request from the state itself, or a clear failure of the state to uphold federal law or protect its citizens' rights. And there's another critical step. Before the president can actually deploy troops under the Insurrection Act, they are required to issue a presidential proclamation. This proclamation formally orders those involved in the civil unrest or rebellion to disperse. It's a public declaration that the situation has escalated to a point where federal military intervention is deemed necessary, and it serves as a warning before force is used. So the Insurrection Act essentially acts as a legal override to the Posse Comitatus Act in these very specific extreme situations. It's the break glass in case of emergency clause for domestic military deployment. It's a recognition that while we generally want to keep the military out of domestic policing, there are rare instances where federal intervention is necessary to preserve the Union, enforce federal law, or protect fundamental rights. However, even when invoked, it's a highly scrutinized action, and it often comes with significant political and social ramifications. This brings us to another key player in this discussion, the National Guard. The National Guard, a different beast. Okay, so we've talked about the active duty military and how the Posse Comitatus Act generally keeps them out of domestic law enforcement, with the Insurrection Act as a rare exception. But what about the National Guard? We see them deployed domestically all the time during emergencies, protests, or natural disasters. Are they different? They are. And this is a crucial distinction. The National Guard operates under a unique dual status. They can be activated in two very different ways, and their legal authority changes depending on who's calling the shots. So what are these two ways? First, the National Guard can operate under state authority, which is often referred to as Title 32 status. In this scenario, they are under the direct command of the respective state governors. When operating under Title 32, the National Guard is not subject to the Posse Comitatus Act. This is why state governors can deploy their National Guard units for law enforcement purposes within their own states. For example, during civil unrest, natural disasters, or to assist local police. They are essentially acting as a state militia. So if the governor of California deploys the California National Guard to help with a wildfire, that's a Title 32 activation. And the Posse Comitatus Act doesn't apply to them. They're acting as a state force. However, the president can also federalize the National Guard, bringing them under federal authority, which is known as Title 10 status. When the National Guard is federalized, they become part of the active duty U.S. military and fall under the command of the president. At this point, they are subject to the Posse Comitatus Act, just like any other active duty military branch. The only way they can be used for domestic law enforcement is if an exception, like the Insurrection Act, is invoked. That's a really important distinction. It means that when you see the National Guard out during a domestic event, you have to ask, are they under state control or federal control? Because that determines what they can and cannot do. This dual status allows for flexibility in responding to domestic crises while still maintaining a critical check on federal power. It ensures that states retain a significant degree of control over their own security forces, and that the president can't simply bypass the Posse Comitatus Act by federalizing the National Guard for routine law enforcement without a compelling legal justification under the Insurrection Act. So we've covered the laws. Have presidents actually used these powers? And what happened when they did? These historical examples really highlight the complexities and controversies surrounding domestic military deployments. One of the most famous instances was the Little Rock Nine in 1957. The desegregation of Central High School in Arkansas. That was a huge moment in the civil rights movement. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, used the state National Guard to prevent 9 African American students from entering Central High School, defying a federal court order for desegregation. In response, President Dwight D. Eisenhower invoked the Insurrection Act and federalized the Arkansas National Guard, ordering them to protect the students. He also deployed elements of the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock. This was a clear example of the Insurrection Act being used to enforce federal law and uphold constitutional rights against state resistance. So in that case, the president did send in troops, but it was specifically to enforce a federal court order and protect civil rights. And it was a direct response to a state defying federal authority. Another significant event was the Los Angeles riots in 1992. Following the acquittal of police officers in the Rodney King beating case, widespread civil unrest erupted. The governor of California initially deployed the California National Guard. As the situation escalated, President George H.W. Bush eventually authorized the deployment of federal troops, including active duty Army and Marine Corps units, to assist in restoring order. This showcased the interplay between state and federal authority, with both state National Guard and federal forces being utilized. And what about more recent times? We've heard a lot of talk about this, especially during the protests in 2020. The George Floyd protest in 2020 brought these laws back into sharp focus. President Donald Trump publicly threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy active duty military personnel to quell protests across the country. While the National Guard was activated in many states, largely under state control, Title 32, federal troops were not widely deployed for law enforcement purposes. This was largely due to significant opposition from state governors, military leaders, and even within the Pentagon, who expressed concerns about legal bias and the potential for further escalating tensions. So, even when a president considers using the Insurrection Act, it's a huge deal, and it's not something that happens lightly. These historical examples and the debates surrounding them underscore a critical point. While the power to deploy troops domestically exists under very specific circumstances, it is rarely used and always with immense legal, political, and social considerations. The reluctance to invoke the Insurrection Act, even in times of significant unrest, demonstrates the strong institutional and legal safeguards in place to prevent the militarization of domestic law enforcement. Why these laws matter. After all this, why are these laws, the Posse Comitatus Act and the Insurrection Act, so incredibly important for our country? They are absolutely fundamental because they uphold several core principles of American democracy. Checks and balances. These laws are a vital part of our system of checks and balances. They prevent the executive branch, specifically the president, from having unchecked power to use the military against its own citizens. It ensures such a powerful tool is only deployed under extreme, legally defined circumstances, and often with the consent or request of state authorities. Civilian control of the military. This is a cornerstone of our republic. The military is subordinate to civilian authority. The Posse Comitatus Act, in particular, reinforces this by keeping the military out of routine law enforcement, ensuring that our armed forces remain focused on national defense and do not become a domestic police force. This prevents the military from becoming an instrument of political oppression. Protecting civil liberties. Imagine a scenario where a president could simply send in armed troops to break up peaceful protests or enforce unpopular laws. These laws act as a critical barrier against the militarization of domestic law enforcement and the potential infringement on fundamental rights like freedom of speech and assembly. They protect individual liberties by maintaining a clear separation between the military and civilian life. So it's about making sure that the military is there to protect us from external threats, but not to control us internally. It's about preserving the very nature of our free society. The existence and careful application of these laws are a testament to the foresight of our lawmakers and the enduring commitment to the democratic principles. They remind us that while the president is the commander-in-chief, that power is not absolute, especially when it comes to the use of force within our own borders. So there you have it, folks. The question of whether a president can deploy U.S. troops on U.S. soil is far more complex than it might seem at first glance. It's not a simple yes or no. To recap, the Posse Comitatus Act is the general rule. It largely prohibits the use of active duty military for domestic law enforcement. However, the Insurrection Act provides specific, narrow exceptions allowing for deployment in extreme cases of civil disorder or rebellion, often requiring a state's request or a clear failure to uphold federal law or protect constitutional. And let's not forget the National Guard, which has a unique dual role, operating under either state or federal authority with different rules applying to each. These laws aren't just dusty old text. They are living, breathing safeguards that protect our democracy and our civil liberties. They ensure that while our president has immense power, that power is not absolute, especially when it comes to using the military against its own people. It's a delicate balance, but one that's absolutely essential for a free society. What do you think about these laws? Did anything surprise you? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video. Also, subscribe for more content and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next deep dive. So y'all know what it is. Until next time, take care of each other, love one another. Peace.
Thinking about starting a YouTube channel but don't know where to begin? Or are you looking for like-minded individuals? Consider joining our community, Grounded Life. Scan here or the link is in the description.